Dear Sir, I respond with much pleasure to your request that I should give a somewhat detailed account of my observations during 82 days of the past summer and autumn spent under your direction in the interests of the Bureau. Flora Haynes, 1888, Bangor, Maine.
In 1888, the Maine State Bureau of Industrial and Labor Statistics conducted a survey to assess working conditions for women in the state's shops and factories. The Bureau hired Flora Haynes of Bangor to complete the survey. She spoke with women in the workplace and handed out over 600 questionnaires that asked about health and safety issues, wages and work hours, sanitary conditions in the boarding houses, and other matters. At the end of the questionnaire was this statement: "Make any suggestions that you think will tend to improve your condition at work." Hundreds of women responded. These are their voices.
I work hard and make good pay. Would rather do so than loaf half the time for less money. I do not think that any female can stand or sit constantly at work without injury to health, a fact that is demonstrated by the great number of puny children that throng the streets and alleys of manufacturing cities. Weaver and Woolen Mill.
The 1888 report was only the second of several reports conducted by the newly formed State Bureau of Industrial and Labor Statistics. The Bureau was created at a time of increasing labor unrest in Maine and came into being largely as a result of pressure supplied by a prominent labor union at the time, called the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was a national organization that welcomed women, men, skilled and unskilled workers. The Declaration of Principles adopted by the Knights in 1869 called for the establishment of state-level agencies to collect information on workers in order to assess the educational, moral, and financial condition of the laboring masses. Their recommendations were initially unheeded, but in 1886, when some 13,000 Maine workers joined the Knights, the state legislature voted to support the recommendation to establish a Bureau of Industry and Labor Statistics. The newly created agency began collecting and compiling data the following year. Their reports, which were done annually, vary in focus from year to year, moving from one industry to another and one group of workers to another. The second annual report, published in 1888, contains the richest collection of women's comments. The report states that because many women and girls work in Maine, it is the duty of the Bureau to make special and distinct inquiries into the conditions which surround the female wage workers of the state.
My health has failed in the last 4 months, and my doctor said I must rest for 2 or 3 months or break down entirely. How can I rest when I have not been able to save anything out of my wages? A woman's life is pretty hard nowadays, I think. Shoe worker.
The report consists of a lot of statistics, but the really valuable part in this particular second annual report, which was done in 1888, consists of the working women's descriptions of their jobs. Very often we can read in history books about women's work in the 19th century. We can read about even in novels that were written in the 19th century. But rarely do we get a chance to read the actual descriptions that the workers themselves have written.
Any scheme that will educate and elevate the masses of workers will improve their condition. I think that ignorance is the greatest obstacle to the working class. Miners still continue in the mills, are employed there in disregard of law. Still, much has been done for working people, and we hope for more in the future. Weaver in Woolen Mill.
Industrialists were drawn to Maine by powerful rivers like the Androscoggin that flows through Lewiston and gave life to the Bates Mill complex here in the mid-19th century. But labor also was readily available, and this, along with the other rivers like the Kennebec, Saco, and Penobscot, combined to make Maine a favorable enticement to large-scale manufacturing interests.
In Maine and elsewhere in New England, the first wave of workers into the factories were women because there weren't a lot of men to take these jobs, and because on the farms the work of women was greatly reduced in the early 19th century by the fact that some products were now available, such as candles and soap and cloth from England. Women had spent a lot of time on the farm spinning and weaving, and once ready-made cloth was available from England, because the English industrialization happened earlier than it happened in New England, women's work was reduced on farms. Farmers couldn't do with letting their sons go to the factories because the sons were still needed in the fields. But they could certainly spare a couple of daughters. And if they sent their daughters off to these textile mills, then they would have cash because the daughters would send their pay, or at least part of their pay, home for the most of them did. And then they would have the cash to buy what they needed: seed and candles and brooms and shoes and ready-made cloth.